Black Hollow Manor stood on a lonely hill, casting a dark shadow over the small, forgotten town below. The mansion was enormous, its tall windows, sharp-pointed roofs visible from miles away. Even after standing empty for more than a century, it held an eerie power over the town. Nobody who had grown up there would dare step foot inside, but there were always rumors, flashes of lights in the attic at midnight, whispers carried by the wind, and a woman's sorrowful face in the upstairs window. The manor once belonged to Alaric Blackwood, a wealthy but mysterious man who had come to the town years ago with his wife Alara. Alaric kept to himself, rarely seen in the town, but he adored Alara. The townsfolk noticed how he would gaze out in the window with longing, as if searching for something beyond the mansion's walls. Some whispered that Alaric was too possessive, that he kept her hidden away, and then, one night, she vanished. Alaric was beside himself, tearing through the house and shouting her name. He told the servants she had been taken by a dark force, and that he would find her, whatever it took. After days of searching, Alaric too disappeared, and the mansion felt silent. The servants left, never returning, and the doors of Black Hollow Manor were locked, frozen in time. Stories grew about the house, tales of a man who had bargained with something dark and paid a terrible price. Children dared each other to go near the house, but all of them, even the bravest, ran back only after a few minutes. Generations later, Sarah and Ethan, two ghost hunters, decided to investigate. They'd heard the rumors and know this would be their biggest adventure yet. They loaded up their gear, flashlights, cameras, voice recorders, and drove to Black Hollow Manor on a chilly October evening. As they approached, the wind howled through the empty windows, and the house seemed to lean toward them, as if it were waiting. Stepping inside, they were hit by a wall of cold air, heavy with the smell of dust and mold. The grand entry hall was still and silent, but they could feel the weight of 100 years pressing down on them. As they took out their equipment, Ethan suggested, "We'll cover more ground if we split up." Sarah hesitated, but she nodded. She could already feel a strange tension, like someone was watching them. Ethan climbed the staircase to the second floor, and Sarah turned down the hallway that led deeper into the house. She passed through room after room, each one filled with the furniture and decorations left behind, as though the house had simply waited for someone to return. Portraits of the Blackwood family hung on the walls, their eyes following her as she walked. She found herself in a bedroom, where a small photograph on the dresser caught her attention. It was Alara, her face soft and beautiful, but her eyes were distant, almost sad. Just as Sarah looked up, she heard faint footsteps in the hall behind her. "Ethan?" she called out, but only silence replied. She felt a chill run down her spine. Meanwhile, Ethan wandered through the upstairs hallway, drawn to a faint light coming from a room at the end. He entered what seemed to be a study, its walls lined with ancient leather-bound books. On the desk lay an open journal. Intrigued, he began to read. The entries started off normal, describing daily life, but as the pages went on, they grew more frantic. Alaric wrote about feeling trapped, hearing whispers, seeing shadows follow him wherever he went. He described dreams of dark figures and strange symbols, and his growing terror that they wanted to take Alara. As Ethan flipped to the last page, he felt a cold hand on his shoulder. He jumped, turning quickly, but the room was empty. His heart raced, and he backed out of the study. Looking down the hallway, the house felt different. The doors had shifted. Now each one seemed to lead somewhere he didn't recognize. Frustrated, he tried door after door, but every one opened to the same study, trapping him in an endless loop. Downstairs, Sarah was drawn by a soft whisper calling her name. The voice was faint but unmistakable, pleading and sorrowful. She followed it down to a narrow staircase she hadn't noticed before, leading her to a dark, damp cellar. Chains hung from the walls, coated in thick layers of dust, and dark stains covered the floor. The air was cold and thick, filled with a heavy metallic smell. In the shadows, she saw a figure, a woman, with her head hanging low and her wrists bound. It was Alara. Her eyes were wide, with fear as she looked up at Sarah. "Please, help me," Alara whispered. "He won't let me go. He never lets anybody go." Before Sarah could respond, she heard footsteps behind her. Turning, she found herself face to face with a shadowy figure, Alaric. His face was pale and twisted, his eyes empty and dark. "You shouldn't have come," he said, his voice soft but chilling. "Now you'll stay with us, just like her." She tried to back away, but she felt herself rooted to the spot, as if invisible chains were holding her there. Alara's eyes filled with tears as she whispered, "I'm sorry." Upstairs, Ethan was trying to find his way out, his panic growing with every failed attempt. He called out for Sarah, but his voice was swallowed by the thick silence of the house. The hallway seemed to twist and close in on him, leading him back to the study again and again. The cold grip on his shoulder grew stronger, pulling him back towards the journal on the desk. He felt as though he was losing himself, like something was forcing him to stay. Days passed before the townspeople found their abandoned equipment outside of the manor. There was no trace of Sarah or Ethan, and the townspeople began to whisper that the spirits of Black Hollow Manor had claimed 2 more victims. But some say that if you venture near the manor at night, you might hear them, 2 new voices joining the old ones, a man calling out in desperation, and a woman's quiet, fearful sobs. And every now and then, the voices call to those passing by, using their names as if inviting them into the shadows. For those who dare to enter, Black Hollow Manor waits, and it doesn't let anyone leave. In a small, quiet town, Thanksgiving wasn't a big celebration. People remembered the dark past. Long ago, in the 1800s, a terrible snowstorm hit on Thanksgiving night, trapping a family in their farmhouse. With no food, no way to escape, the family disappeared. Townsfolk said they heard a strange scream that night, but when morning came, nothing was left but snow and silence. The old farmhouse still stands, untouched and empty. Each Thanksgiving, locals say they hear strange noises from inside, so they keep their distance. Jenny and her friends were curious. They thought that ghost stories were just stories. On Thanksgiving night, they decided to explore an old farmhouse to prove there was nothing scary about it. The house looked dark and abandoned. Its broken windows watched them as they walked to it. The air felt colder as they stepped inside, almost like the house itself was waiting. Inside, they found dusty rooms and old furniture. The dining room still had a table, set with dull silverware and old plates, as if it were waiting for dinner. Jenny felt uneasy, like they were disturbing something that was better left alone. Then the door slammed right in front of them, locking them in. The temperature dropped even lower, and they could see their breath in the air. One of Jenny's friends made a nervous joke about inviting the family back for Thanksgiving, but no one laughed. Suddenly, they heard scraping around the walls, followed by a soft, desperate whisper. They couldn't make out what it was saying, but it sounded like someone was begging. Then, they noticed something that made their stomachs turn. The table was now covered in food. There were roasts, pies, and other dishes, all steaming as they've just been cooked. But the food looked strange, the meat too pale, the vegetables a weird grayish color, and the smell was awful, a mix of sweetness and rot. Just then, shadowy figures started to appear outside the windows, pressing against the glass with empty eyes and wide open mouths. One by one, these ghostly figures moved through the walls, staring silently at Jenny and her friends. It was the family from long ago, with cold, bony hands reaching out to them. They whispered in voices like a cold breeze, "You took our place, now join the feast." The next day, when people came looking, they didn't find the group, but the old table was set again, with fresh fruit on each plate, as if Thanksgiving feast had just been served. And around the table, there were 5 chairs with people sitting in them, frozen in place with terrified faces. Since then, no one dares to go near the farmhouse on Thanksgiving night. People say that each year, another chair appears at the table, waiting for the next person, brave or foolish, enough to take the seat at the Thanksgiving feast. Decades ago, a subway line was shut down after a tragic accident claimed the lives of every passenger on board. The train had allegedly derailed in a dark tunnel, plunging into a hidden, flooded chamber beneath the city. In the aftermath, rescue teams could never retrieve the bodies, and the tunnel was mysteriously sealed off. Over the years, tales of ghost trains that never reached its destination began circling among subway drivers and the city's night travelers. It was close to midnight when Greg stumbled down the subway steps, weary from a long day. As he reached the platform, a train rolled in, seemingly out of nowhere. Its headlights flickered in the dimness, illuminating rusty metal and cracked windows. Despite the strange appearance of the car, Greg boarded, desperate to get home. As soon as he settled in, the doors hissed shut and the train jerked to life. Greg watched the familiar stations blur past, yet the train didn't stop. Growing uneasy, he glanced around. Only a few shadowy figures dotted the seats, their faces turned away or obscured by shadows. He stood and moved towards the conductor's car, but with each new car he entered, the world around him grew colder and colder. The advertisements were now blank, as if wiped of all color, and the overhead lights buzzed in weak, sickly shades. Passengers dressed in outdated clothing with vacant eyes sat in eerie silence, giving him only sideways glances. As Greg neared the end of the third car, a ghostly woman whispered to him as he passed, "Turn back before you reach the end." Her hollow voice sent chills down his spine. He hesitated, looking back, but found the door he'd come through was now locked. Turning forward, he continued reluctantly. The train picked up speed, and outside, the tunnel had become nothing but an endless void. The subway's screeches and rattles blended into a nightmarish mix of noises as Greg opened the door to the next car. This time, every seat was empty except for a single man staring directly at him. His eyes were vacant, yet his lips parted with a grim smile. "There's no going back," he murmured, almost gleefully. Greg bolted through, desperate to find an exit. But as he opened the door to the next car, he was met by complete darkness. The train had vanished, and he was alone, standing in the middle of a decayed subway tunnel that seemed to stretch on forever. He looked back. The train, the passengers, even the ghostly conductor were gone. Greg's story became one of whispered legend among night shift workers in the city's subway. They say sometimes if you listen closely, you can hear a faint sound of footsteps echoing in the abandoned line, searching for a way out, yet never finding it.